Wallah. Those are the that's the blooper reel, or the behind the scenes. Somebody else might have got that. Gonna show up on one of those late night talk shows, like, look, here's creeping Sharia. I said, look, if we can get some new plant that's like ground cover plant, like a vine, either a vine or ground cover, and we bring it in and we market it to the nurseries and to Home Depot and Lowe's, and we say this ground covering is called creeping Sharia. It'll cover your whole yard really quickly. It'll choke out any other plants that you have in your yard, choke out weeds. Okay. There was a couple good questions that I got during the break. One is definition of ijtihad and definition of Sharia. And those two questions also bring in another very important point, which is definition of words is extremely important. We're going to talk about this in the Maqasid of Sharia, that one of the biggest things is definition of word, like the example that I gave about yaqeen. We have to define words. So how are we defining ijtihad? Ijtihad means basically you're making a judgment. Okay, we're making a judgment about something. We're making a judgment about something. Is this water drinkable? Would everybody say yes? Is there a possibility that this is poison? Is it a possibility that it's vodka? Right? That's what kids in my high school used to bring in, because it looks like water. They'd put that in their water bottles. Or it was just one kid that did that. But anyway, I overgeneralized. But is there a possibility that this is vodka or poison? But we have now we have assigned a judgment to this. We have all said this is water. So right now what we just did is ijtihad. Now, why did you say this is water? You have your dalils, right? It's a bottle of water. It says water on it. It's sealed. It looks like water. If we opened it up, it smells like. You have all of your dalils of why you believe this is water. But you have assigned a judgment to this. Now, if Allah had ordained that this is vodka, but you have ruled that this is water, did your ruling align with the ordainment? No, it didn't. So your ijtihad there was a mistake in that ijtihad. So ijtihad is just making a judgment. And judgment comes in three areas. There's three areas basically that we make judgments. We make rational judgments. And I'll give an example for that. There's conventional judgments that we make. And then there's revelation judgments. This is understanding these three areas is very important. So there's reason or rational judgments, there's conventional judgments, and then there's revealed judgments. So an example of a judgment that comes, an ijtihad that comes out of reasoning. 1 + 1 = 2. Does everybody agree? So we now have just assigned a ruling. We have said 1 + 1 = 2. Did that come out of the Sharia, or did it come out of our reason? Reason. Did we have to observe nature to understand that 1 + 1 is 2? Or we just sit here and we're like, if I told you, right, 1 is 1/2 of 1/6 of 12. It makes sense, right? Did you have to go to Sharia to get to agree with that judgment? Did you have to observe the natural world around us to make that judgment? You didn't. So that's a ijtihad, that's a hukum. So basically a judgment is called a hukum. So you can say ruling, but you can also say judgment. So we have judged this to be sound, or we judge it to be unsound at the level of the aql, at the level of the intellect. So that's one area. Convention is if I say the sun rises in the east and it sets in the west. And Tupac also said it sets in the west, right? He put that in one of his lines. I didn't listen to Tupac growing up, but recently I've come to appreciate some of his lyrics. I'll just say that. He was a poet that had a lot of a lot of hikmah. But anyway, he said that it rises in the east, but it sets in the west. Now, we've observed that. We've observed that happening. We've observed things in, that comes through observation, or we can talk about the rotation of the earth and the movements of the oceans and the phases of the moon. Whatever we do through observation, that is a judgment that we assign to that through observation. So that's called adi. So it's basically hukum aqli, hukum adi, or hukum shar'i. So a judgment that's in the Sharia. The Sharia, and this comes to the next question, which was about how am I defining Sharia? Is Sharia fiqh? The answer is no, it's not fiqh. Fiqh and those specific rulings are a part of Sharia, but it's not where the Sharia is. The Sharia, the revealed, basically Sharia is the revelation. It's revelations, judgments about certain things. So the sources of that are the Quran and the Sunnah. And then from that we get the sciences that allow us to approach that. The sciences of tafsir, of hadith, of fiqh, of any sciences that help us understand what is the ruling based on revelation, not reason and not convention. Does that make sense? Those three areas? So that's how we're defining Sharia. We're defining Sharia by saying anything at any time. If we say the average age of a human is ... the average age of this bottle is whatever. We've assigned a judgment based on some source. That source is either our intellect, our observation, or the Sharia. So the Sharia is those revealed sources. Does that answer the question about the Sharia? Yeah. The hadith is part of the Sharia. Yeah. So if you, over here, I put sources. So up at the top is the sources of the Sharia. So the sources of Sharia rulings, when we make those ijtihad rulings, are four. Two primary and then two sub-primary. Basically the Quran and the Sunnah. That's where we get the rulings from. The Quran, of course, that's clear, the book of Allah. The Sunnah includes three things. It includes the hadith, the statements of the Prophet. It includes his actions. And the third thing, what does it include? Not the muwafaqat. His statements, his actions, or tacit approval. What he didn't say anything, right? So if the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam if he stays silent about something, that's a ruling. And this is because the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam in his station, because he is the source of revelation, he is the source of revealed rulings for us. Everything he does, people are actively watching him. So when he went to a group of people who put down lub, which is desert monitor lizard, they cooked up a big lizard, put it down for him. It was the Prophet and some of the Sahaba, and the Prophet ﷺ, did he eat from the lizard? He didn't. What was the Sahaba's first question? He didn't say don't eat it, haram. He didn't say eat it, it's an obligation. He just didn't do anything. But what did they ask? Is it haram? Because your non-action is actually speaking something to us. And he said, no, it's just not for my custom. Like he wasn't raised eating desert lizard. And I actually had the opportunity to implement this sunnah twice in my life, actually 4 times. In Mauritania, I was served desert monitor, water monitor, tortoise, and porcupine. We woke up one morning and there's no butchers out there. We would get meat like maybe once a month, once every 6 weeks. So we woke up and there was this fresh red meat in this bowl at our tent. And me and my friend Nabil, we looked at it, we're like, this was on the weekend. So we know sometimes on the weekend the students will slaughter a sheep and sometimes they'll give their neighbors a little bit of the meat. So we woke up and we looked at it, we're like, it's red meat, so it's very red, so it's not chicken. But it's not big enough, it's bigger than a chicken, and it looks like lamb, but it's too small to be a lamb. We're looking at like what is this? So we went around and asked our neighbors, and the night before one of the students went out hunting and got a porcupine, and it's very interesting how they hunt porcupine because they got the needles and stuff, right? So another time they had tortoise, and they asked me if I wanted to eat, and I said no, I can't eat an animal that might have been around at the signing of the Declaration of Independence. It's like I'm not eating that animal. And last time, remember we were joking about not eating dolphins? This guy started sending dolphin emojis to me because I said, I wouldn't eat dolphin. That's basically like, would anybody eat dolphin in here? Just out of curiosity, if we served dolphin? Maybe? Okay, one. Where was I? A couple days ago, and I got, actually, remember that, right? At the halaqah, the high schoolers were like half the room said, yeah, I'll eat some. So, you would try it? Okay. I don't know. This, it's khilaf, it's ijtihad. Okay, so how did I get off on that? I was talking about tacit approval. So the Prophet ﷺ didn't eat the dab. The Sahaba said, is it haram? He said, no, it's just not for my custom. And the ulama who wrote about prophetic medicine, they said this is one of the prophetic medicine. Basically, if you don't feel inclined towards something, don't eat it, especially when you're sick. And the Prophet ﷺ would go, when people were sick, one of the things he would ask them, is there anything you desire? Is there any food that you're having a craving for? I know somebody who was, one time he was battling hepatitis, and he said during that he got this craving for crab meat and iced tea. And one time somebody brought him a slice of pizza. He's like, I can't eat that. And so if you know about hepatitis, it causes the enzymes to create all these the liver to create all these extra enzymes. You get a lot of heat in the body. And so he was talking later to a homeopathic or a naturopath healer, and he said in terms of the scales of meat, the coldest meat is crab meat. The coldest meat around. So your body was telling you, eat the coldest meat. Don't eat hot meat like lamb. And he said tea and lemon and of course ice, he said on the scale of hot and cold foods, those are on the far end of the cold. So your body was telling you these are the cold things that you should eat to help reduce the heat. So anyway, so tacit approval. So the sources of the Quran, of revealed law, of rulings, are the Quran and the Sunnah. The Sunnah is his statements, his actions, or his non-actions, i.e. his tacit approval. From those, we start getting the tools to be able to derive rulings. So if we were to say, is it an obligation to pray 5 times a day? I'm asking you, is it? Okay, so it's an obligation to pray 5 times a day. That's a ruling. So somewhere along the line, somebody made ijtihad and he got out this ruling is it from the Quran? Because nowhere in the Quran does it say pray 5 times a day, but it's in the Sunnah. The Sunnah proof. So there's qiyas, there's analogical reasoning. That's what I put Q there for, and then I for ijma', consensus. We're not going to go into the usul because this is not an usuli discussion, but we do have to have some ideas. So from these sources, from Quran, from the Sunnah, from the ijma', the consensus, the Q, the second Q is for qiyas, analogical reasoning. This is like this. If this is true, then this must be true. If this is haram, then this must be haram. Cocaine, is it mentioned in the Quran? No. Well, alcohol is, and if cocaine is enough shares enough attributes as cocaine, then we're also going to assign the same ruling. Okay, but the process of using those primary sources, we develop principles and proofs, which are the usul. So each scholar will have his or her, if there was a female mujtahid, which there was, Aisha was a mujtahida. So his or her proofs, that then they will use these proofs to analyze future rulings. So that's the usul. Now, understanding this will tell us where the maqasid fits in. From the usul, from those principles and proofs, we derive specific rulings, specific fiqh rulings. Okay, now this whole process of going from the primary sources to the principles that we derive it, to the rulings that we come out of that's the primary sources, the usul, and then the fiqh, which are the rulings. The person who's doing this is the mujtahid, and the mujtahid is the one doing the ijtihad. The ijtihad, consider that there's 4 types of mujtahids. The first one is the mujtahid mutlaq. This is the absolute or the unfettered, unchained mujtahid, meaning this mujtahid, he or she is accessing the primary sources to derive the rulings. They're not following somebody else. So when Aisha radiallahu anha, if you look at some of the interactions, when she was answering questions, especially after the passing of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, she would use proofs. She would say this ayah or this hadith. Umar was doing the same thing. Abu Bakr was doing the same thing. Uthman, Ali was doing the same thing. All of these mujtahids were doing the same thing. Ibn Mas'ud, Ibn Abbas were doing the same thing. So these are the mujtahid mutlaqs. Their students are the mujtahid muqayyad. So when you hear about the students of Abu Hanifa, the students of Malik, the students of Shafi'i, the students of Ahmad ibn Hanbal, they're at the level of muqayyad, meaning they're chained. So the muqayyad, the reason why he or she is chained is because they don't access the primary sources of the Quran, the Sunnah, or the qiyas. They don't access those. So take any of the students of, say, Shafi'i or Malik, or they don't say this is the ruling because of this Quran or hadith. They base it on the usul of the mujtahid that they're following. Does that make sense? So they treat those rulings just like the mujtahid mutlaq is treating the primary sources. That's why he's a muqayyad. Now this is going to help you understand what's happened in 1400 years of Islamic scholarship. So you had some mujtahids who were accessing the primary sources. You had the muqayyids who were working within that system and developing rulings. Then as time goes on, you have so many rulings that now you say, wait a minute, we have two statements of Imam Malik that are contradicting each other. We have two statements of Abu Hanifa. Which one is right? Or we have a statement of Imam Malik that goes against all of his other statements. Like if we took all of his statements together and then we started looking and trying to find common themes or patterns, once we derive that, now we derive an usul, a principle of the madhab, of the school. And they say if this statement is going against the principle, then there's something not wrong, and we're going to give weight to the other opinion. Now, I know putting a lot out there. Is everybody generally following? Yeah? Okay, good question. Why the muqayyid is not accessing the primary sources? Because one of the conditions of the mujtahid, there's actually a number of conditions. There's a lot of, they have to be experts of the Quran, the experts of the Sunnah, the experts of Arabic language, experts of, there's a lot of expertise that they have to have achieved, and then they can access those primary sources. Their students have not achieved that expertise, and so that's why they're muqayyid. Now, it doesn't mean that other people can't reach the level of mutlaq. So one of the reasons why some people say we should study usul or the maqasid is so that we could quote unquote reopen the door of ijtihad as if it was closed. It's still open. If somebody wants to go out there and attain that level of Malik Abu Hanifa, go ahead. It's still possible. But even if a person like gets to that level of mujtahid, how do we know that they're at this level? That's you were going to ask. How do we know? The reason why, were there only 4 imams that reached the mutlaq level? Then why do we only say those 4? Those are the ones that are still intact. Okay, but even the Zahiri madhab went up to about the 5th century. There were other schools. Sufyan al-Thawri had a school, al-Awza'i had a school, Layth had a school. The Sahaba, each one of them essentially was a school. They didn't have that specific name, but they had students that were following their methodologies. So I will give you so the way we know that is through ijma', which is a source. Quran, Sunnah, ijma'. So if the consensus of a people, of the scholars of a certain age, say this imam is a mujtahid mutlaq, then we can take that. So Imam Malik, it was discussed. Everybody was in agreement. He's a mutlaq imam. Like it's peer reviewed, double blind, all of that process happens. Dissertation committees, we're talking about like not 2 or 3 or 4 people, we're talking about hundreds of people. Imam Malik studied with 600 scholars. 600 scholars. And at the time when he was 17, that's when they said in Medina that he began teaching at 17 after being given permission from essentially I'm calling it a dissertation committee of 70 of the top scholars of Medina. So 70 of the top scholars of Medina said he's able to be a mutlaq imam, and people can get rules from him. So that's how we know that. So if somebody says I'm at the level of a mujtahid, we say, good for you, man, great. But we don't know if has that been verified. And this is why I tell people there's some people who teach fiqh, F-I-Q-H, and there's some people who do fiqh, P-H-I-Q-H. With the PH from philosophy. They just philosophize. They'll take a little bit of the rulings, a little bit of the usul, study the maqasid, and now you're going out there. Which, like, we're going to say, it doesn't seem sound, but if you have reached the level of ijtihad, then that's good for you, but we don't have ijma' to ascertain that you're a mujtahid. We could, if there was ijma' of the top scholarship, but it also, the other thing is that it takes a mujtahid to know a mujtahid. So we need a large body of mujtahids to be able to make that judgment. No. If they're out there, we don't know. Like there's not necessarily, there's people that claim it, but that's the question that now we have to, as a community, we have to say if somebody comes forth with a representation of the Sharia, of the rulings, are they at the level of ijtihad? Okay, now so I want to get into the maqasid, but what was happening at the level of the muqayyad, okay, the mutlaq. What the mutlaq mujtahid was doing, he was looking at the Quran. And he's seeing certain patterns and certain themes and certain sunnahs. So that when things come up that that have not been addressed, he's able to address them. And he can have a proof to back it up. The muqayyid, he's swimming in the ocean of his imam's rulings, right? Ibn al-Qasim say he's decades with Imam Malik. He sees he sees how Imam Malik is answering questions. He said, this is haram, this is a condition, this is an obligation, this is apostasy, this is not apostasy. He sees all of that, and then the muqayyids, they start deriving principles within the school. And so they'll use those principles to analyze new situations and try to make their best judgment, saying, we think that this is in accordance with the usul of Imam Malik, who's saying this is in accordance with what Allah wants. But it's all a process of ijtihad. Is that making sense? Okay. And then we have the murajjah. So now somebody might say, well, how do I get included in this process? That's why I put the fourth, which is analysis and application. So, for example, facing the qibla in prayer. Is it a fard or is it a sunnah? Sunnah? Fard. Okay, so we got some people saying sunnah, some people saying fard. According to the four schools, it's a fard. It's a condition. So because the Quran says, فَوَلُّوا وُجُوهَكُمْ شَطْرَ الْمَسْجِدِ الْحَرَامِ. Turn your faces toward al-Masjid al-Haram. Allah is giving an order. Is this an order of obligation, of sunnah, of recommendation, of permissibility? Because Allah also says, كُلُوا وَاشْرَبُوا وَلَا تُسْرِفُوا, right? Eat and drink and don't be wasteful. Thank you. Don't be wasteful. So when Allah says eat and drink, is that order means constantly eat and drink? We understand it to mean, what is that order showing? It's eat from the permissible. Like it's permissible to eat and drink. So it's an order of permissibility. There's an order of obligation. There's an order of sunnah. The mujtahid there's actually 14 different types of orders. So if somebody says, oh, I know Arabic and I can access the Quran, just say, what are the 14 types of orders that are found in the Quran and the Sunnah and in the custom of the Arabs? Give me those 14 kinds. And if they don't say, that's just one aspect of the toolbox of the mujtahid that he needs to be able to access the Quran. And you don't even know the distinction between those 14. So the mujtahids have assigned to us that facing the qibla is a fard, it's a condition. But now, if you're in a situation where you have to figure out the qibla, how are you going to do it? What are some of the proofs that you would use? The sun. What else? What is that? Muslim Pro, an app. Yeah. What else? When you go into to a masjid, do you just pray whatever direction? The mihrab. When on my first journey to Mauritania, I got stuck in France, which is another. I think it's on one of the podcasts on the Safina Society. I talked about how I got stuck in France. I ended up getting stuck there for 12 days. And a lot of interesting situations happened. It was good for my growth overall, alhamdulillah. It was frustrating, but it was good. When I came to one of the masjids that I was eventually able to stay there for a couple of days, they just had the lines in the room, but there was no mihrab. So I just did my wudu, and I'm like, alhamdulillah, I found a masjid stuck in France. And I started praying, and some brother came and he turned me all the way around. Yeah, he turned me all the way around. So I made my ijtihad there, and I'm following this. Now the question then becomes, how else do we find it? We might use the sun, the stars, the sun, the moon, the compass, the mihrab, the direction of a masjid. There's a lot of proofs that we can use. So that's how I want to say that the way we're involved in the process of ijtihad is analysis and application. We have to analyze the situation, and then we have to be able to apply the ruling in an attempt to make this matching the wisdom to the ruling that we apply. Does that make sense? So, how many people have taken one imam's opinion on one situation and another imam's opinion on another situation? I'll start the group session. Hi, my name is Rami, and I've done that. Who else is here? That's it? Everybody else is 100% one madhab person? We've all done that, right? Now, during that process of making that decision, do I follow this fatwa or that fatwa? This opinion or that opinion? We're not reinventing ijtihad. Okay, we're not reinventing the mujtahid mutlaq muqayyad. What we're doing is we're analyzing our situation and we're trying to apply something to our situation. And that's where the tools of maqasid are going to help us. The maqasid, the objectives of the Sharia. Not that we reopen the door of ijtihad and we say, oh, I want to be like Malik, I want to be like, we should do that instead of I want to be like Mike, right? I want to be like Malik. And you notice there's a lot of mention of Imam Malik, right, going on here? And I'll mention that for a couple of reasons. And Medina, the picture of Medina is right there staring me in the face. But I am Maliki by school. I studied in Mauritania. The book that we're going to be going over is the Muwafaqat, which is done by a Maliki scholar. So that's kind of the paradigm that I'm working within. So you have to take that into consideration as you hear. And I tell people if somebody graduated from Harvard, they're going to talk about Harvard all the time, right? So you're going to hear that from the people. They're reflective of their schools, of the scholars that they've studied with. So take that into consideration whenever you hear somebody out there. So this analysis and application, this is what each one of us is going to do. You're listening to YouTube lectures, you're reading fatwas online, you're trying to figure out something, and you see all these fatwas out there. Now, how do you know what's right? Can we buy a house on riba in America? Have you seen fatwas on both sides of the debate? Yes. Can we eat McDonald's? You've seen fatwas on both sides of the debate, right? Can we listen to music? You've seen fatwas on both sides of the debate. Think of like, those are my, if you go to a convention and you don't get these three questions, riba, music, and meat. Those are like the constant ones. Every convention, am I wrong? Every share, like meat, music, and riba. Those are like it's almost like the pillars of an Islamic conference or a talk. So they should just like have a recording and go ahead and, but the reality is, isn't there a lot of fatwas out there? Right? It is. We're not living in a 100% one madhab society. Andalusia, what was the primary school there? They were Maliki. And they were so Maliki that they couldn't think outside the box. And they mentioned a story that there was two soldiers on the beach one time and they saw a man praying with his hands in qabd, right over left, which the Malikis pray with their hands at the side. These two soldiers saw that man praying with his hands right over left and they said, look at this mushrik, praying salat al-mushrikeen. دعنا نقتله ونقطعه قطعا ونرميه في البحر. Like, let us go and just kill him, chop him up, throw him in the ocean, and nobody will ever know the better. Okay? But that happens when you're in a society that's like 100% Maliki. Their rulers are Malikis. The Qadis are Malikis. There's other madhahib, but they've not been exposed to that. So you have to take that into consideration. You know, there's certain levels of that in every single person who's relaying a hukum. So that's one of the things that you can take into consideration. But when it comes down to that point of making that choice of what you're going to do, I'm not saying we're going to learn the tools and be a mujtahid, mutlaq, muqayyid, or murajjah and give credence to one or the other opinion. But you have to be able to analyze the situation and you have to be able to apply a ruling. And knowing the toolbox of the mujtahid and knowing the objectives of the Sharia will help you in making that choice. And at the end, I'm going to leave the last session. I know we have two more sessions. The last sessions, I have some case examples where I'm going to show you where this can happen. But I want to jump right into the study of the maqasid. Now, I've drawn something up here on the board, which is a circle with three. Does this ring a bell for anybody? Anybody all? What's that? Yeah, it looks like a target, yeah. And hey, we're teaching Sharia, so that's part of the process, right? We have to have this militarization of our lessons, right? No. Anybody familiar with this? I'll give you a hint from a TED Talk. Yeah, you've seen it? It's called the Golden Circle. There's a man by the name of Simon Sinek, and he studied a lot of successful companies, successful leaders, successful thought leaders, and he tried to find out what were the common themes in them. When I heard this, the reason why I liked it is because I said it articulated something that's a part of our Sharia, that's a part of our understanding. Excuse me. So one of the things that he said is that successful companies don't focus on what they are doing or how they're doing it, they focus on why they're doing it. Successful leaders don't focus on what they're doing it, how they're doing it, they focus on why they're doing it. And he gave us an example. Martin Luther King said, I have a dream. He didn't say, I have a plan. right? He didn't talk about, I have a plan of like, this is what we need to do, this is how we need to do it. His speech, I have a dream, is just talking about the dream, the why. And he said that's what moves people. Now, for the Muslim, even before we get into the Maqasid of the Sharia, what would you say in our tradition answers the question of why? What's that? Okay, to intergender, but to what we're doing something. Like if we analyze an action, so we're talking about analysis of actions. We do something, you do pick something, anything as a Muslim, part of your worship. Make wudu. What we're doing, we make wudu. How do we make wudu? Right, and my son, 6-year-old, the other day, he asked me a question. He was asking me, he's like, but how do we know that? Right, how do we know that? So I told him, like, he's like, okay, I understand like what we do and understand how to make wudu, but he's like, why? And how do we know that? That's the question of why. Why do you make wudu? Intention. Could you make wudu on a hot day and wash your whole body? Right, just to relieve, do wudu to kind of cool off. That's an intention. So for me, when I heard that, I said, this is speaking to something in our tradition that is intention. Don't we hear that a lot? Intention, 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 intention. A person, if this was actually water, but I thought it was vodka and I drank it, did I do something haram? Yeah. Because of my intention. Why? Why did I drink? The Sharia is not concerned about what you did. You drank vodka or how you did that. No, the question is, what was your intention? Why did you drink that vodka? Well, I thought it was water. So this is a big part of our Sharia, which is looking at the intentions. So the way I'm going to put this as a model close to the sources of usul, the what is the fiqh and the rulings. That's the fiqh and the rulings. So if we say wudu, this is what wudu is, this is the limbs you have to wash, this is fard, this is sunnah, all of that. How did we know that? What would you put over there? Put the sources. What else would you put in there? Could we put the usul in there? Because that's talking about how. How did we derive this? Why did Imam Malik say it is sunnah to pray with your hands at his side? It wasn't because, has anybody ever heard, he was beaten? Who's heard that? He was beaten, right? Yes, he was beaten by the governor of Medina, who was forcing people to take pledge allegiance to him, and he narrated a hadith. La talaqa fi ighlaq. There is no divorce under compulsion, which by analogical reasoning, if a leader forces you to take allegiance under compulsion, under fear of death, it's not compulsive. They beat him until he couldn't walk home. They had to carry him on a mule home. All of his joints were dislocated, not just his arms. They beat him to where, towards the end of his life, he had so much incontinence because of a bowel disorder, he couldn't even pray in the masjid anymore. That's how severe the beating was for narrating this hadith, and he continued narrating it. And just as a note, the person who was enacting the beating was an Abbasi from the family of the Prophet ﷺ. And Imam Malik later he said, at every lifting of his arm, جَعَلْتُهُ فِي حِلْ. I said, I've forgiven you. I've forgiven you. Because لِقَرَابَتِهِ مِنْ رَسُولِ اللَّهِ. Because he's from the family of the Prophet ﷺ. And he saw a dream later with the Prophet ﷺ, happy for what he was doing. But that was just a personal thing, that at every beating he was forgiving the person for that lashing. But he was actually specifically asked about praying with the hands at the side, and or with the hands right over left, and he narrated the hadith in the Muwatta about praying with the hands right over left. But he said the scholars of Medina pray with their hands at the side, and that's my proof. That's an usuli proof. Okay? So all of this is happening at the what or the how. But now we come down to the why. Somebody might say this prayer is wajib. This transaction is invalid. How did you answer that? But now the question is why. That's where the maqasid comes into. So remember how I was saying the mujtahid mutlaq, he's so engrossed in these primary sources that he starts seeing these common themes and he derives principles from them, right? Then the mujtahids from within that madhab, they're so engrossed in that person's method of thinking that they develop principles for the school, and then below those principles they actually derive further principles, and it just keeps going down. So at the top you have the usul of a madhab, then you have the qawa'id, the principles of that school, and then you have legal rules of thumb. So I mean, I know this is like very legalistic, but the point is that that's all part of the usul. The question would then come, why? Why do we pray? That's not a question that the usuli is going to answer. He's going to say how you pray and give you the proofs, but now the question is, why do we pray in the first place? Why do we have to have our marriages and our business transactions in this accordance with the Sharia? That's the question of why. So in about the 5th century, Imam al-Shatibi, who was influenced by Imam al-Ghazali and other scholars, he wrote a book called Al-Muwafaqat. And it's about a 6-volume book. But he was the pioneer in trying to give definition to answering the question of why we do this in the Sharia. And at first he said he was trying to join between excuse me, I'm gonna drink my water, which I hope is not vodka. Right intention, yeah, it's water. Seems like water. He wanted to do this process of matching the ruling to the wisdom. The wisdom of Allah, like what is Allah, what does He intend? Why does He want certain things to happen? And are we properly matching up the ruling to that divine wisdom? Excuse me. So before we get into that though, a quick note of Aqidah. You can just put this down like Aqidah note. When we ask the question, or have you ever heard somebody say, I don't understand this, but I know Allah has a wisdom in doing this, right? Raise your hand if you've ever thought that, heard that, believe that, right? We all believe that. We've all heard that, or I should say we've all heard that. This was actually a question amongst the scholars of Aqidah, is does Allah have to have a wisdom for doing something? Or can He do whatever He wants? That was an early discussion of Aqidah. Because on the one hand, we have ayahs that say, وَمَا خَلَقْتُ الْجِنَّ وَالْإِنسَ إِلَّا لِيَعْبُدُونَ. I have not created the jinn and the ins except that they worship me. So here, some people reading that ayah will say, well, the ruling is we have to worship Allah. The reason is because Allah wants us to be worshippers of Him. That's why He created us. Why did He create us? Because of to become His servants. Other scholars said Allah does not need, or we should not impose our way of thinking into understanding the actions of Allah. So the way we think, excuse me, a person either does something for a reason or no reason, right? Is there a third category? Like in our human understanding, is there a third category just that we can think? You either do something for a reason or for no reason. And you might be a bad reason, might be a silly reason, but you either do something unintentionally or intentionally, for a reason or for no reason. Now, are we going to impose that method into the choices of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? That was the question. Can we actually confine Allah to say He doesn't do things for no reason, right? أَفَحَسِبْتُمْ أَنَّمَا خَلَقْنَاكُمْ عَبَثًا. Do you think that we created you in jest, in play? So we're going to say that Allah doesn't do things for no reason, so He must do things for a reason. Well, some of the ulama say no. There's an ayah that says لا يسأل عما يفعل وهم يسألون. He is not to be asked about what He does, but they will be asked. So in this ayah, it's saying you can't ask about Him, and so about what He's doing. You just do what He's ordered, and He doesn't necessarily have to have a reason for it. So now this is a Aqidah point, but just keep it in mind. Imam al-Shatibi is going on the assumption that yes, there is a wisdom for what Allah is doing, and that's where I'm going to derive these common themes. So in about the 5th century Hijrah, he is developing this. He wrote the Muwafaqat. He said, I see there's a lot of differences between the Hanafi usul and the Maliki usul. Is that my phone? Oh. Sorry. I know this is going to be hard for the listener too. The audio engineer is going to have to cut all these out. Because it's really annoying, isn't it? To listen to a speaker like, these are going to all be... these are all going to have to be cut out. Okay. So he wanted to, his intention was saying Abu Hanifa's usul is different than Imam Malik's usul. And when he says Imam Malik, he actually means Shafi'i as well, because the Malikis and the Shafi'is share the same usul. But the principles for why do we have different madhabs, the Malikis and the Shafi'is? Because from that same usul, they derived separate principles, qawa'id. The qawa'id of the Malikiyya and the qawa'id of the Shafi'iyya differ, which give us different furu', which give us different rulings. But because they're so close in terms of sharing the same usul, the Maliki, if he or she does not find something in the Maliki text, the first madhab that they're supposed to look to say what would be the proper thing for a Maliki to do is in the Shafi'i school, because they share the same usul. The Hanafis differ drastically in a I'm sorry. I've had this issue my whole life, so. Oh, thank you. If the Hanafis differ, he says, but I want to see if Abu Hanifa and Imam Malik and Shafi'i by extension are deriving separate usul, separate hows, and then by extension separate what? Can they agree on the why? That was his question. Can all of the madhahib agree on the why? And that's what he set out to do. And so he looked at all of the fiqh and the usul and so forth. And then he found this. He found these objectives of the Sharia and he listed them out. And then from there was a lot more development up until even recently. People are continually developing the question of how we answer the why of the Sharia. He initially wanted to name his book, and this is very important to make as a note. His initial intention was عنوان التعريف في سر التكليف. The عنوان التعريف, the title, the title of knowledge in the secret of taklif. Taklif being responsibility. So Allah has given us responsibilities. Responsibilities in faith, responsibilities in worship, responsibilities in transactions. And but if we say, I'm a Muslim, this is what I have to do. That's the taklif, everything that we have to do. The question is though, why? The question that little kids answer, right? Oh, just Allah said it, which is fine to a certain extent. But if you really want to gain that tranquility of the heart, especially when we have so many attacks on the Sharia, wouldn't you say it's a daily thing now? It's a multi-billion-dollar industry to attack Sharia. You want to make money? I'm not saying do this. But if you pretend you left Islam and you criticize Islam, there's a lot of money on those circuits for those people. There's people who pretend to have become Muslim. Have you ever seen some of these guys? And the way they even pretend to say things in Arabic, it's like, are you serious? So anyway, but if we want to answer the question of why did Allah, because He could have just created us and left us be. But He actually gave us responsibility, through revelation, transmitted those responsibilities to us through the words of His messengers, and now we have this taklif, now we have this responsibility. Why? Why is it? So Imam al-Shatibi wanted to name his book Inwan al-Ta'rif fi Sirr al-Taklif. He had a dream where his sheikh said, what are you working on? Why are you doing it? What's the title? And he said, why are you trying to do it? He said, I want to understand if there's a way that we can look at the multiple usuls of these madhabs and say, is there an overarching thing? He said, why don't you call it the muwafaqat? And that's what he called it. He called it the muwafaqat. It's a 6-volume book. There's been some abridgments, the notes that I did for this course, which up until this point, this was supposed to be the first hour. So I apologize. We're not going to get into everything. But I did some notes on the abridgment of this book. And I'll mention the names of the abridgments and where you can do further studies of this. But we're going to stop at 2 minutes. We'll stop at this. Actually, really, any questions? We'll just take a quick question. We'll use the last 2 minutes for questions on this section. And then the last 2 sessions, we'll go into the meat of the subject, which is the Maqasid. But I thought it was very important for us to understand how we get to this point. Oh, the murajjih. That's the murajjih, that once you have multiple opinions within the school. So every school has multiple opinions. Anybody that tells you there's no khilaf, they haven't studied. And there's a joke, one of the most famous scholars in Mauritania, I mean, this is mentioned as a true story. His name is Mukhtar Wilbuna, and his father was not very knowledgeable. Mukhtar Wilbuna, Sheikh Mukhtar, was very knowledgeable, known throughout the land. His father wasn't. And he was afraid that sometimes people would say, oh, your son's this big scholar, you must be a scholar too, and then ask him questions. So he told his father, if anybody asks you a question, just say, fihi khilaf. There's a difference of opinion. And so then later some of the people came to Mukhtar and they said, Mukhtar, we're worried about your father. He said, why? He said, because we asked him about Allah, and he said, fihi khilaf. There's a difference of opinion. He said, yes, there's a difference of opinion. The Christians say this, the Jews say this, and the Muslims say this, and the correct position is what the Muslims say. So there's a khilaf about everything. And one of my shuyukh, one of the famous teachers of Quran in the area where we studied in Taganit, Shaykh Muhammad Ali, and he's the one who taught me astronomy in the desert. And there's clear skies in the desert. And he used to, I'd have to say, like, slow down, Shaykh. You know, like, and this star and that star and this one rises at this point. And he was the mu'adhin of the masjid. He never had a watch on his hand. And if you asked him what day, he said, in the Christian calendar, we're on this day. In the alternate Christian calendar, we're on this day. In the Hijri calendar, we're on this day. And the sun is rising at this point. It's setting at this point. The sixth of the night is at this. The weather is going to start. Like, he knew everything. And alhamdulillah, I was able to meet him and study with him as well. But he said people have khilaf about everything illa hubb al-ta'am, except for love of food. There's difference about everything except for love of food. So there's a khilaf about everything. Now, within the madhab, you have many multiple opinions. The Maliki school is not just one opinion, one person. There could be 4, 5, or 6 opinions from the mutlaq imam. There could be 2 or 3 narrations of Imam Malik. The muqayyid, the mujtahids from within the madhab, they might have differing opinions. And so the murajjih, what he does is he say, okay, now I've sifted through this. We have 4 opinions. Which one is the most correct in the Maliki school? He has to have the tools to be able to say this opinion or that opinion. Does that answer your question? Maybe one more before we break? Yes. Good question. So the mujtahid mutlaq has to have expertise in many different fields. Who set this rule? Basically, it's how is somebody able to open up the Quran or look at the Sunnah of the Messenger of Allah and make a correct hukum, make a correct judgment? And so the ulama at the time, it wasn't a specific thing, but they looked at people, like for example Shafi'i. Shafi'i is looked upon as one of the scholars that we can go to. We look at Imam Malik. Once we look at all of these scholars and we start seeing the common themes, that's where we can derive these. We can say, well, if everybody at Malik's time, everybody at Abu Hanifa's time recognized him as a source of giving a hukum directly from the primary sources, what common things did they all share? They all had this level of Arabic. They all had this level of this. They all had this level. They were able to reverse engineer. That's basically, it comes through reverse engineering. So the way we get the usul of the imam is through reverse engineering. The way we understand how did that imam reach his point is through reverse engineering. Is anybody a fan of Malcolm Gladwell's books? Yeah? He's a good writer, right? He takes a lot of dense material, presents it in a very, digestible format, and it's engaging. You can read his book really quick. So I was interested in understanding, like, what's his writing style? So there's actually a course on how to write like Malcolm Gladwell. And I think it might be from, I don't know exactly where, but one of the things it mentioned in there is that said that in reverse engineering, you rarely have the expert able to explain what it is they're doing. So they said, if you went to Malcolm Gladwell as an example and asked him, well, how do you write like that? He might not be able to articulate how he's writing. So we need outside people to look at that, to analyze and say, well, what are Malcolm Gladwell's usul? What are the usul? How did he get to this point? And so if you have multiple people doing the reverse engineering process, then we can now get a guidebook for that. And that's what happened with the early imams. The later scholarship, we're looking at that, and then they filtered, and they'll say, here's 15 areas of expertise that the mujtahid has to have. Here's 20 areas and so forth. Does that answer your question? I think we'll break right there, inshallah.